Hello and welcome everyone to Book Breaks. This week we have the pleasure of talking to Tamara Payne on the book, The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. I am your host for this session, Keisha Rimbert, and I am a Gilder Lehrman Master Teacher out of Illinois, and we have your moderator, your Q&A moderator, Micah Morton James, who is our Book Breaks intern. Just so that you're aware, the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or the positions of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. All right, let's get into today's guest. Tamara Payne graduated from William Smith College in Geneva, New York. And after that, she went on to work for NewsHour for about a year before moving to China and teaching English there. That sounds exciting. After returning, she helped her father create the work that we are going to talk about today. She was a principal researcher while also working in commercial real estate. Before her father's sudden passing in 2018, and she made it her purpose to finish his life's work. Let's talk a little bit about the book, The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X. It traces Malcolm X's life from really even before his birth in Nebraska in 1925 to his assassination in 1965. In this text, Les Payne provides some searing vignettes that really take us through Malcolm's life, including his religious awakening and transformation to the Nation of Islam in a Massachusetts penitentiary. I am so excited to get this conversation going. Welcome, Tamara. It is a pleasure to have you. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can really start to have a conversation about this awesome work. Welcome.
Thank you, Keisha. How are you?
I am great. So this book is acclaimed. You've won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer, the NAACP Image Award, and been on the short and long list for so many others. You have to be such an incredibly proud daughter. And I'm sure that your father would be an undoubtedly proud father that you are carrying on his mantle. What was it like to work on this book with your father, the renowned journalist, throughout this process, and then bring it to completion, honoring really his 30 years of dedication to this story?
My father asked me to work on the book when I came back from China. He had, he was a follower of Malcolm X, and he didn't really think that we really needed a biography of Malcolm X until, he met one of Malcolm's brothers, and he had conversations with him and interviewed him, and decided that, there's so much rich information about what Malcolm's life was, his family life, his parents, this incredible little family, the family of the Littles. I mean, it's an incredible family. And we're talking about from his mother, Louise Little, and his father, Earl, both of whom were incredible influences and leaders to him as followers of Marcus Garvey. And so is this the details that my father learned from one of the brothers, that he said, we don't know this about Malcolm, and it gave him such further understanding and insight into who Malcolm was. And as a journalist, when you're looking at a story, you look at for what's new. So when I came back from China and my dad was talking about this, and I understood my father's relationship to Malcolm, as well as mine, it formed my relationship to Malcolm, because he used to play while I was growing up for me and my brothers, but really for me, because I'm older than my brothers and my mother, a lot of his speeches on the weekends. So I would hear Malcolm and Martin and others, but really Malcolm, and he would just keep going back to Malcolm. So I had a rich relationship with Malcolm early on also. And this idea of understanding Malcolm through my father's eyes, learning about it, and then understanding the kind of journalist my father is. I also was interested in journalism. I wanted to learn the craft from him. And this was a great opportunity to do that. So the years of working with him together for 28 years and then finishing the book, I mean, it was heavy, it was serious work. I learned so much just about journalism, about interviewing, about finding people and doing research and how all this comes together. It was an incredible experience. So yeah, I wouldn't hand over those years to anything else.
Yeah, I was just in awe, in all honesty, that there seemed to be no interview, no reading, no document overlooked in this telling of this story. And what I appreciated a lot is that this Malcolm's personal history was situated in the context of a detailed Black history, along with its challenges and triumphs. Could you talk about why the need to ensure that not only Malcolm's story was told, but also the larger story of Black history?
Yeah, and that's the other thing. My father wanted to make sure that when we talk about Malcolm in the context of his family, that we also talk about the context of the family in the context of American history, not just simply Black history, because Black history is American history. It's part of it. And so understanding, for example, what it was like the summer of 1919, where were these riots happening? Where were these lynchings happening and why? And who was instigating this? I mean, that's American history. That's just not simply Black history. And making people see it that way. The Depression, the years, and all of this understand this is a part of the full context of American history. It is, history should not be glossed over. In order for us to move forward and make new mistakes and progress, I believe we have to understand what happened, how it happened, so that we don't make the same mistakes. And moving forward, we learn from those mistakes, but we'll make new mistakes. I mean, we're not perfect. We're still learning, but it's so important to understand it. And this idea that history makes us uncomfortable. I mean, we have to sit with what it was, because while people are talking about how people feel uncomfortable, think about how uncomfortable people feel as Malcolm's family, descendants of Malcolm's, and people who look like him, like us. I mean, it's, everybody's saying, well, people are uncomfortable having these conversations. I said, but think about the people who are uncomfortable where our stories haven't been told all these years. So here's this opportunity where we are, where a lot of this stuff is coming into the forefront, and it's so important.
Yeah, I also found that the book just does a great job of humanizing Malcolm in a way. I remember reading, growing up, the autobiography of Malcolm X, his collaboration with Alex Haley. And while there was this humanistic element of it, this book brings into the fold his early life and the family and the Littles as this unit. And so it rounds out this account of his life. How did your father gain the trust of Malcolm's siblings and so many others who spoke so candidly about their interactions with Martin in ways that they hadn't done before?
For us, it's just being journalists. Journalism is really about relationships and learning, connecting with people and hearing their stories, understanding their stories, so that you can understand what is going on in the world. And so when you meet people, everybody has a story, and you just want to know, well, what is it like being you? And, and the brothers were open to that. Some people are not as open, and then you have to work at different ways of connecting with them. Maybe it's something sports, Malcolm, like when they were talking about boxing, that's a way of connecting. And then you find that you can open up, and that's important. So a lot of times the job of the journalist is to connect with people and finding ways to connect. And sometimes that may mean bringing in somebody else who might connect with your subject and getting them to open up too.
Why did you really, when I talked a little bit about this before, but the story really starts even while Malcolm is in utero. Why was it important for your dad to start that story there versus later on in Malcolm's life? Why so much focus on the Little family early in particular, and Malcolm kind of being this favorite child?
It's important to understand the world that Malcolm was born into. He was born into this family of Garveyite organizers. So, Earl was he had risen to be a regional, leader of different regions. And when they were spreading the word of Marcus Garvey and organizing Black families in towns where Black families had not yet organized, and organizing, setting up your community, building up businesses, how do you support each other, and making sure that you guys are pulling your resources together. I mean, and this is, about creating self-reliance and creating that, also the independent thought, being free mind, free thinking. And then also being proud of who we are as Black people, because everywhere we go, you have to keep in mind the world around them. Black people are told that they can't live in certain sections. Black people, and there's segregation going on. It's Jim Crow America. So you can't share facilities. You can't be in the same swimming pool. You can't go to schools with white people. So there are these messagings that are being told to Black people. And now, how do Black people rise to support each other and feel good about who we are? It's important. This is a continuing theme, even with us today. And so to see it, that it's been going on and it never stopped, right? Mm-hmm. So it's important to see that historical development.
Absolutely, absolutely. There were a number of things that that I was kind of shocked about as I read the book. So there's the revelation of kind of who the founder of the Nation of Islam was, and the fact that not only did Malcolm and other members of the nation meet with the Klan, but also that Marcus Garvey had met with the Klan. So was there anything that shocked you as you were engaging in research? And I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in conversations that you had with your dad. And how did these things influence Malcolm? How did things like that meeting influence Malcolm and thus influence American history, as you say, with a focus on Black history? Were you worried that you were going to just even tarnish ideals as you presented such detailed information?
You can't get in the way of the story as journalists, and even as a biographer, I'm understanding more and more that you really should not insert yourself and your feelings of the story. You have to let the story unfold, but you got to find what the story is and contrast and compare what has been told in the past and what you're finding out. And even if as the vessel here, right, you may be even adding something here, because I think what was really important that my father added while we're working on this, and one of the things I learned, I felt that I was working with history. My father lived through a lot of these periods. He had seen Malcolm speak. He had asked him a question. He was highly influenced by Malcolm. He was influenced by Martin Luther King. He was well read. He lived, he was born in 1941. So he lived through Jim Crow South. His family moved up north. So he lived through a lot of these periods that we were writing about. And so as somebody who was Black, a journalist, and uncovering stories about this time, just me as not just his daughter, but researcher, I was learning so much of this history from somebody who was also there. Mm. And then seeing the lens that he's also able to shed on that through the facts that he knew, through the experiences that he understood. For example, family, the importance of the father-son relationship, the importance of the mother, having a mother who's telling you to read newspapers, having your children read newspapers. Like, we have this in our homes, but how many times is this portrayed, in the stories that we see in media about us? Mm-hmm. Unless they're told by somebody, one of us. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of, what will you bring into it, but you're not getting in the way of it. You're shedding more light on it. And then the other things is a lot of people like to talk about when Malcolm was in Harlem and he was hustling and stuff like that, but still keeping in mind, putting in the context, Malcolm wasn't the only person hustling. Everybody was hustling. Mm-hmm. Soldiers were hustling who were coming home off break. Everybody was hustling to make ends meet. And so what does that look like? Numbers runners were running and holding numbers for who? Those are the kinds of questions you ask. They don't, a lot of times they don't ask those questions and portray that in these stories, but those are the kinds of things that we have to look at. And it for me, I just felt that our work was being such an important contribution to answering those types of questions and allowing us the space to even question it. Like, I always wondered that. And here's a confirmation, okay, that is a valid question.
Yeah, I love that this book is about Malcolm, but it's also answering so many but it's about something larger as well. So many larger things. First of all, was there anything that shocked you while you were researching where you were like, oh my goodness, what do I do with this information? How do I present this? How does this information get presented effectively to the public?
When we would find something, and it wasn't so much that was shocking, it was always about, what does this mean? That was the question, really. What does this mean? How does this play out? Who are the other people? Like when we look at the Klan story, to me, when you're explaining the entirety of that story, Elijah Muhammad has his national organization. He wants to build up businesses in the South. He understands how he's from the South. He understands how the South works. He understands that in order to do business, you have to do business with people who are members of the Klan. Mm-hmm. And so when he's instructing Malcolm and Jeremiah Shabazz to meet with the Klan, he's saying, here's our agenda. Let's find out what their agenda and see where we can help each other out on. But that is about, we see that compromise happen every day. When you put in that context, it's not as shocking. And so again, to me, it was about, what does this mean? What is the full story here? And these are the questions that we have to ask about that. And then understanding, and then when you see what the Klan says, they want to know more information about, one, we have respect for you, and how you stand up for your people. We love the fact that you don't want to be with us. We don't want to be with you. You want to be over there. Be happy, But the other thing is how they want to find out more information about who, Martin Luther King. And so that, and then looking at the fact that Malcolm didn't give it up. And even Elijah Muhammad said, we're not giving that information up. So to me, it was that larger context. This is all this plays into. So you have to, it's not so, okay, this happened, but what does that mean? Even if you look at the context of Marcus Garvey meeting with the Klan, that was at a different time. And so his perspective was, look, America's going to go to the white man. We need to figure out where a Black man's going to be. And that's in Africa, right? So that's what he was saying at that time. And again, it's not about right and wrong. It was about, where are you going with this? And how does this fit into your agenda of being self-sufficient, self-reliant, and proud of who we are? And where do we connect? Where's our homeland? Where's our motherland? Where's our connection?
Yeah, I love that you brought up that, that they're asking about Dr. King and yet Malcolm and the nation.
I'm kind of hoping people have read the book by now. So
yeah, I know we're spoiler alert, right? And if you haven't, there's still so much to read. There's still so much. Really, it is a phenomenal text. I felt like the book showed a duality of physical and physical and spiritual space that Malcolm occupied. And sometimes they're at odds with each other. So what can you tell us about Malcolm's evolution spiritually? He's the son of a minister. He goes to church to appease Ella at first. Then he joins the Nation of Islam. And physically, him being this fair-skinned Black male, which is mentioned a lot in the book, I think, to address elements of colorism and some of the privileges that he has within certain spaces, as well as him being kind of a vagabond who moves around a lot. What can you tell me about that evolution of him spiritually and physically?
Vagabond in the sense of while he was a minister traveling, you mean?
Yeah, and even in his life, his family moves quite often, and just he in some instances, I find that he just doesn't have a place that he can root himself and call home.
I think he was rooting himself for a long time within the Nation of Islam, and his family was rooting themselves with the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And so there's a huge organization there that they kind of had connections with, including, as we find, even their close connection, Marcus Garvey, right? The parents. But the thing, I look at Malcolm's evolution and I see them as really as transformations, because I really feel that Malcolm, what Earl and Louise Little teach him and their connections with him and his other siblings. I mean, he has 7 other siblings. That carried with him throughout life. Those lessons, they stayed with him. When you think about, his dealing with our rights as civil rights at the end of his life, and he wants to take this to the international stage and fighting for human rights, and saying that making charges against the United States government through the United Nations and getting other foreign states to support, this move. But that's also coming out of the connection, and it's adding something else into the changes of the world onto what Marcus Garvey was preaching too. I mean, it's a different movement, it's a different direction, but it's and he wasn't saying everybody move to Africa. He was just saying, acknowledging, our connections. We have to acknowledge where we came from, but also acknowledging that, Africa is important. It's important in this world. It's important to us, and we need to make connections, and Africans need to connect with us. And that was also really important. And we see that even today, right? Just in how we connect throughout the diaspora. And I think that that's a continual message, and that Malcolm carries forth even today, that we have these connections. So I think that these lessons that he had early on, and keep in mind, his mother Louise is not from America. She's from Grenada. So she brings with her already an international perspective. And so Malcolm has this from early on. He doesn't think of America as the end all to everything. He may not understand it, what that means to him while he's hustling in New York, but as he gets older and he's looking at the world, and certainly when he's traveling, he grow on that whole perspective. And it's quite, to me, phenomenal to watch that, to understand that that's what's happening. And but also understanding that Malcolm never turned away from his original agenda, which was freeing Black people and addressing how we see ourselves and how we treat each other, but also freeing Black people from the constraints of racism. And even when you look at how he was looking at the whole idea of voting in 1965, he died before the voting right was passed. But that whole idea is like Black people using their votes in a block, and that's exactly what ended up happening, right? We see that even that's occurring and that's impacting how the elections are being run today. But Malcolm was talking about that back then. And so all of this is like, it's all growth. It's the arc of his life. And it's just, to me, it's so important to see that, because we keep turning back to Malcolm, right? And the question is kind of, why do we turn to him? And he was great with language, and this is something that he worked on, not while he was in jail, but he's been working on that since he was a little boy in Louise's kitchen, with his siblings, looking up dictionary words, reading newspapers. And, and just even that image, again, it's like, I think about how that image is not portrayed in so much of the immediate presentations of Black families, but how many of us in Black families had that experience?
Yeah, and even the distortion of who Malcolm was, I think, has Malcolm's image and who he was. I think this book does a great job of disrupting that distortion of who he was, because the autobiography of Malcolm X is part of the educational canon, or the experience that a lot of students get to have and read. And I feel like this text will absolutely join it. And I hope if educators are on this call that they pick it up and actually have their students read it. What advice would you give to educators who want to introduce this book to their students? How would you say that they should position it? What should they focus on as their students read it?
I think that this book gives a much fuller and fills in a lot more of the voids that were surrounding Malcolm, particularly because when we talk about Malcolm and how he was misconstrued, particularly by the media, let's talk about the Violence Act. He never preached violence, he preached self-defense, but in that climate, it was very easy to twist his words to look like he was preaching violence. But he actually would say that, and he would say that that's exactly what the media was doing. And it's like, these are certain, and we bring that out in our text, how that was done. And his relationship, particularly if you look at his relationship with the media, these are things that even today we see happening. And I think that this book gives a fuller context to that. So I definitely see it. I mean, I think it's a standalone, but I also think that it's a great supplement and complement to the autobiography, especially because when looking at this, at Malcolm's life, we wanted to look at, of course, Malcolm in his speeches, but Malcolm, as close as we have him in talking about his own life, is through the autobiography as told to Alex Haley. And so, again, the questions are like, how fully is that, rendered, that it's solely Malcolm? And, that can be, those are discussions for scholars to just debate throughout the end of time. But I think that as a supplement, that this is, and a standalone, it just tells this great story of this extraordinary man, but it also fills in so many of the gaps. And it takes time to go into some of the areas that were even holes in this book, in the autobiography. And it really takes the time to kind of explore some, some of them, quite a few of them, and quite a bit of what we were able to nail.
I appreciate it, even the talking in the book about the fact that perhaps he doesn't talk more about Louise and the times that he spent as a 13-year-old traipsing through Lansing, because it was hard for him.
Those are difficult times, right? And when we talk about, for example, when we talk about mental health and what people are experiencing within their relationships today, but none of this is ever applied to what Malcolm was going through after losing his father. And that was a huge loss to him and his family. In our book, we call it The Anchor is Lost, right? That was his anchor, his father, on so many, that important father-son relationship of how to be a man, how to be honest, how to show up, right? And then when you lose that at that age, it's terrifying. And so, and then on top of the fact that you're feeling yourself, you're starting to individuate as a teenager, right? And I think that, it'd be interesting to look at it in this way too, but in the context of how a family is running, and as well as the pressures the family was up against to survive.
If you had to tell another story, if you felt like there's a story, is there a story from this book, whether it be Earl or Louise or Ella or Elijah or Betty, is there another story in this book that you would want to tell, or that you think needs to have more light shed on it?
I think there's so many, there are so many. I liked, the story of Ella, for example, of how she was so strong. And again, somebody is probably going through similar, because she kind of was on the wrong side, but she also was able to buy this house, that's in Roxbury on a hill, and it's still in the family's name. So that this is important. I would love to see more about her too. There are other peripheral characters I would like to see more. And I was always intrigued, and I met Vicky Garvin, who Malcolm met when he was in Ghana. She worked with the labor here in New York before, and she actually saw Malcolm, when he was hustling. But then she saw him again while she was working in Ghana, and he came through, and he had gone through the Nation of Islam, and he was splitting, and just seeing him develop at that time. But Vicky Garvin, I thought, was a really interesting person too. But there, so many of these people are interesting. Because actually after Vicky left Ghana, she went on to China, and so I think that she has an incredible story to tell too. And so many, there are so many people. who are in this book.
All right, my last question for you before we get to the audience question. How do you think this book changed your dad? And how did it change you as a researcher and editor?
And writer.
Yes, and writer. Right.
It made me see what the process is. Before it was such a mystery of how to write books, and I've done freelance pieces over the years, so I do identify as a journalist, but I just feel that writing has taken a different approach for me. I've taken a different approach towards writing throughout the process of this book, and also the ideas of telling stories. And it changed Dad in that sense too. He didn't change how he saw Malcolm. He saw Malcolm as he becoming even more important, than he had thought before, and more dynamic. And this whole idea of, particularly when you're looking at how important Marcus Garvey was to him, and even at the end, what he was doing with Marcus Garvey, with that work, and he was bringing something else, because it was like he was updating it with the times and making it even more important. But the sense was still there, the whole connection of what the diaspora, people in the African diaspora should be doing. It's there. And but how Malcolm, speaks also to oppressed people throughout the world. How people in France were picking him up, and in Israel were picking him up. I mean, and of course on the continent in Africa, but people are still picking him up. And you ask the question, well, why is he still being picked up? Because he speaks to people, who are facing this, and how to look at their oppressors. And it's just really dynamic and interesting to see how, even today, that they're still clinging to Malcolm, and picking him up. So just seeing that importance and understanding that, I don't know that Malcolm saw himself that way, and but I'm glad to see that he has been, influential in this way to so many people, and that people still keep going back to. And I hope that we grow even more on what Malcolm's work was doing.
Yeah, I'm excited that this spurs additional text and ideas and couplings for that. So thank you for an amazing contribution to the field of Malcolm X, and just wonderful work. So I will, with that, hand it over to Micah to add questions from our audience.
All right, then. Thank you, Keisha, and thank you, Ms. Payne, for being such a great, for carrying this torch with such a momentous book. And before I'd like to share our student question of the week, I'd like to pay a little tribute to the man who introduced me to this fantastic book, Dr. Emery Tolbert from Howard University, the Howard University History Department, who recently, unfortunately, passed away just a few weeks ago. And I'd like to dedicate this this section to his memory, with discussing you in this book. Our student question of the week, and as everyone knows, is a weekly contest where students from across the country can have a chance to enter, ask our weekly guest for the week a question regarding their work. And this week's question comes from Shantae Mitchell, an 11th grader from Williamsville South High School in New York. And they asked, did you ever find yourself subconsciously relating to Malcolm while writing and researching this book?
Subconsciously relating to Malcolm while writing it? Throughout, yes. I mean, just learning what he must have been going through and how that must have been feeling was always a question in my mind. And another thing that, I also thought about was, particularly when you're looking at the assassination, I was thinking about his family, his own daughters, and just what that was like for them. It's terrible tragedy, and but it's yeah, I mean, you kind of you want to get into Malcolm's head, and you're doing this biography on him, but you also, you wonder, like, what was that like for him? And we try to get as close to what we thought, what was going on in this work.
Right. And our next question, one of our first questions, comes from Carol, who would like a little bit of background in terms of, would you be so kind to provide the details regarding the term Garveyite when describing Malcolm's parents?
Sure. They were organized for the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the organization founded by Marcus Garvey. He's from Jamaica, and he brought it over into this country. And it was about helping Black people who were living in a very racist country, and helping them to organize and stand up for themselves and being proud of who they are. And partly what they would do, how they would do this, is by supporting themselves and being proud and understanding their history and how they got to where they are, but also in building up their own communities, starting their own businesses, being self-sufficient and independent-minded, as well as being proud of who they are as Black people.
Our next question comes from John, who—
And I'm sorry, also connecting back to Africa. It's very important to make that connection.
Yeah, very important. Yep. Our next question comes from John, who would like to know, is the criticism that your work does not, quote unquote, dig deep into Malcolm's political theory accurate? And if so, why the absence of a critical analysis of his political theory?
We were focusing on Malcolm's life.
Okay, our next question comes from Lubna, who would like to know, who has a question regarding Manning Marable's earlier biography of Malcolm X. And Marable cited letters from Malcolm X in which he described the unhappiness of his marriage to Betty Shabazz. Marable's source for these letters was the Nation of Islam. Do you think these letters were authentic?
I mean, they were out there. I'm not, and people were using them. Sure, I mean, they were authentic. But that was, we weren't focusing on, his marriage. We were focusing really on Malcolm as he was moving through life. And yes, his marriage is a part of that, but, we wanted to focus on what we focused on.
Our next question comes from Leah, who thanks you for this, for being a part of the show, and mentions the famous quote by Malcolm X that the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman, and the most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. Can you tell us what you learned about his relationship, about his mother and other Black women in his life that gave him such a clear perspective on how Black women were treated and viewed in the United States?
When we look at what happened to his mother, for example, after Earl dies, and how people are going after her. She has these children. The support system is not there. The government is trying to take land away from this woman who's trying to raise her kids by herself. And even some of the older children who are, of an age where they're also trying to help her and supporting her. But where's the community support? Where is the government support? She's getting her wages and from this probate judge, and the probate judge is demanding that she sell her land to him. So there are so many examples of this. When you look at, his relationship to even his sister, he complains to his sister after his father dies that he doesn't want to stay in Michigan, and he begs her to bring her to Boston, and she manages to do this. I mean, these aren't easy things to do. These are relationships that he sees, he witnesses. He has strong relationship with Black women at different times of his life, throughout his life, and at different women of different stations, but he sees clearly how they're treated.
And I guess when we're talking about treatment, our next question actually comes from Peter, who wants to know, why did the press focus and report negatively on Malcolm's push to change the racist culture at the time and treat Martin Luther King as a more peaceful individual?
Because when Malcolm tells people to stand up for themselves, Black people to stand up for themselves, this is seen as Black people coming out of their station in society. And this was a threat to white people. And so they don't want that. When you have Martin Luther King who's preaching to be dignified and using nonviolence. And the thing is that you needed both of them at that time to kind of even counteract each other so that they can even make the choice to go to a Martin Luther King over a Malcolm X. And it's interesting to watch that play out throughout history, their relationship and how people gravitated to a Martin Luther King. Because if they didn't have a Malcolm X there, what would they do to a Martin Luther King? Would be a question that ones could ask. But, we are only looking at what actually happened as journalists. I'm not really speculating on, I don't like to dive into the whole speculation as far as written work. And the other thing I want to get back to the question on as far as Malcolm's relationship with women. Malcolm also saw how women being treated in the context of the society and the times that he was in. And it's just really important to see Malcolm, through our work. And I mean, I think it's important to see everybody, but we're focusing on our work and on Malcolm to see him in the context of the times that he was living in. And so that's where what we have to look at. Society, at that time was very was very hard on women. They couldn't, it was difficult for them to hold jobs, but it was also difficult for them to even have their own bank accounts. And so on and so forth with that. As far as this other question about why they went to Martin Luther King, I would say that when you have these two, it is easy. Martin Luther King is an easier choice to work with, than a Malcolm. And in Malcolm's group, Nation of Islam, at that time, they were not interested in integration. They wanted separation. They wanted to live separately. And so, that worked to some people's, arguments and agendas like the Ku Klux Klan to try to work with them. And it didn't work to everyday people who saw that as a threat to them. But the problem is that when people feel threatened by a Malcolm without even trying to understand why he's saying it and in the context of what he's saying it in.
And speaking of, his relation with the Nation of Islam, what makes Christine would like to know, who first says that I found your book, found the part of the book that explored the assassination of Malcolm X, who was convicted of the killing and versus who likely did it, quite fascinating. Do you know if the findings from your book had any influence on the exonerations of Muhammad, Aziz, and Khalil Islam in 2021?
Well, I think you have to look at the process. I think you start with the work of what was going on with the documentary that was on Netflix, Who Really Killed Malcolm X. They were doing their own investigation. We did a separate investigation. And when that movie was on and they were exposing, our book I think that came out in February. I don't think we had fully came out yet. I can't remember the timing right now, because we came out at the end of 20. And I think that the process for opening up that case, I remember it's February of 21. I can't remember the timing right now. But as far as, the exoneration, they definitely looked at it, the people who were working on this. But I think you have to look at the timeline of what's going on. We did our own separate investigation, what we were in telling our story. The documentary did its own, but what we come to are similar conclusions, but we come at from different directions. And that's important to look at that in that way.
Okay. And our next question comes from Mikal, who states that Marcus Garvey and Elijah Muhammad did not embrace Frederick Douglass's integrationist vision, yet it seems that Malcolm, at least in his later years, sort of did. or was moving in that direction as he was coming closer politically to the civil rights, to most civil rights leaders. Do you agree with that or not? And could you expound on that?
I'm looking at Malcolm really here, and what I found what Malcolm was doing at the end was he was looking more and looking at taking our fight from the civil rights stage to the international stage of human rights fight. The civil rights movement, the leaders of the civil rights movement agreed with Malcolm on that. So that's the way I really look at it. It's not that he was coming to him. The other thing you also have to look at is that Malcolm was split. He had left the Nation of Islam. He left Elijah Muhammad at that point. And he was also going to form his own organizations. But he wasn't, he was wanting to work closer with the civil rights organizations, I felt. But I felt that he still wanted to have his own organization that was independent of what everybody else was doing, because he had his own thing, and what he was looking at was simply that was focused on really freeing the minds of Black people, but also bringing our fights against racism here in America and our rights as human beings that had been violated all these years. And the civil rights organizations at that point, the leaders, Martin Luther King especially, they agreed with that.
All right. And speaking of his later years, can you talk more about how perhaps he may have utilized the principles and concepts from, say, his father and Marcus Garvey as a Garveyite to utilize those types of principles to change groups such as the Nation of Islam, or the group he started, the Organization of African American Unity? How did he utilize those principles?
Well, I would also say that the Nation of Islam itself was built on Marcus Garvey's principles, because the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad also believed in having their own farms and growing their own food, having their own businesses and stores, having their own schools. These are all things that Marcus Garvey also was talking about. So Nation of Islam already was on that and building on it. And this is why Malcolm's family even joined the Nation of Islam. So it was really, they were already on a continuum on that and moving in that direction.
Right. And to further go back on, we've got a lot of questions, particularly about this. Could you explain the meaning of the subtitle, The Dead Are Arising, and how it reflected Malcolm X's life in general?
Well, the title of the book comes from Malcolm's work when it's actually from a letter that Malcolm had written to Elijah Muhammad, but it was during the time when he was working on organizing the temple in Hartford, Connecticut. And this is an important part of the book, particularly for our family, my family, in that my father's family, they moved from Tuscaloosa, Alabama up to Hartford, Connecticut. And that's where he spent his teen years. He went to high school there. He also went to the University in Connecticut and Storrs, Connecticut. So my father knew Hartford, and he spent a lot of time talking about what Black people in Hartford at that time were going through and why they were gravitating and wanted to even have a temple, join the Nation of Islam there in Hartford. So, but Hartford also is made up of a lot of Black people there are very strong Christians. And so when Malcolm was teaching, the tenets of Elijah Muhammad about being self-sufficient, improving your diet, eating to live, no smoking, no gambling, and all of that. It was appealing to people, also particularly like when he's talking about building up your own community, your businesses. It was appealing to people who were Christians, but they were either becoming dissatisfied with what was going on in their churches, but it was also appealing to people who were part of the Moorish Science Temple, and they didn't necessarily want to go into the churches. And so Malcolm was having an interesting time of gaining support and traction in Hartford because of the strong Christian component in the Black community. But he said in writing his report back to Elijah Muhammad that there are obstacles, but we're making way, and the dead there are rising, and that's where it comes from. But it's really about people who are coming to their consciousness and embracing in this particular moment the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, but also embracing seeing themselves outside of and their true selves of who they are as Black people.
Right. We do have time for a few more questions,
Mm-hmm.
and This one comes from Franklin, who would like to know, do you anticipate doing another biography? This is actually multiple questions. And is there another Malcolm scholar would you recommend?
Oh, I mein, I think all of the people who are writing on Malcolm should be read, to be honest with you, for different reasons. You know, I think Peniel Joseph did a great book on comparing Malcolm and Malcolm's philosophy and tracking it through the history of their lives and the trajectory of their professional lives as in the civil rights movement. I think that there are a lot of people out there who are writing about Malcolm's, and I think that they all should be read, even if you disagree with them, but to understand why you disagree with them.
All right, and we do have a question from Jamie, which actually kind of symbolizes numerous questions we've had about Les Payne's story. Sounds amazing. And is there an biography or autobiography available?
That is one of the works I'll probably be working on.
And could you tell us, now I think it was briefly mentioned, but could you tell us more about how your father met Malcolm X?
Sure. My father was in college, and he and his roommate had decided they wanted to see Malcolm speak. And he was speaking in Hartford, Connecticut at Bushnell Memorial Auditorium, and that's where they went. And Malcolm was speaking on segregation versus separation. And my father asked a question, and Brian Steiber asked him a question, more on the philosophies of being a communist. I think it was what Brian asked. My father was kind of curious about the free land, this land that they were going to get from the government, and which was curious to him, but he didn't see that as a logical thing happening, and Malcolm kind of dismissed my dad. But the reason why this was important was during this whole thing of how we see ourselves as Black people, Malcolm would flip between speaking, referring to Black people as so-called Negroes, and he would call us Black people. And every time, even my father, when writing about this experience, seeing the speech, was that he felt uncomfortable hearing him say Black, and and he was accustomed to hearing Negro, and Malcolm actually made note of that, and he said, "I see you're more comfortable speaking," and he's speaking to the audience. "I see you're more comfortable being called Negro instead of Black, but what does Negro mean but Black in Spanish? So what you're saying is I can call you Black in Spanish, but not Black in your language." And that was just eye-opening for my father. And it's like, again, about mindset and how we see ourselves.
Yeah, just fantastic. Just truly been an honor speaking with you about this. And we do have time for about one more question. This one comes from Megan, a school teacher who teaches U.S. history and sometimes gets accusations of teaching extremism when I cover Malcolm X. I usually connect Reconstruction to the Civil Rights era to try to give context to the time of building frustration. Do you have some guidance to help cover Malcolm in a way that my Black and brown kids can learn about his impact authentically?
I mean, I'm not a history teacher, so I would think mainly it's important to read widely about, I think we have to look at information is powerful. And so this movement about putting pressure on how we receive information is really interesting. When talking to students, it is important that students understand that information is very powerful, and understand the whole context of history is important. What you learn about Malcolm, whether you're reading his autobiography or even about him, or even just his speeches, is you learn, one, just as a speaker, his relationship to language is amazing. I would start with just looking at his language and analyzing the language. And and how he would take his audience into consideration, to whom he was speaking, how he would try to connect with his audience too. I think that these are kind of basic things that you would teach about anybody. And the way that Malcolm does it in his style is really important. And then you can get further into the details, into the weeds of more of what he's talking about and the context of what he's speaking of. But I think it's always important to put context. It can't just read this speech and just let loose, because I still hear from people. I mean, I would say as recently as 2 weeks ago, somebody said that he grew up in Hartford, and he said, I knew about Malcolm, but quite frankly, I was afraid of him. And this is somebody who'd seen him speaking around town in Hartford, and they just say they were afraid of him. But then again, it's like, again, we have to look at context and putting in the context. And that's what's great, that you can do this in a classroom, is providing context. But I would start off just saying, like, let's look at the speaker and his relationship to language. Let's look at how he uses language.
Yeah, and with that, it's very important, especially although we're a history program, language is also important into the medium. And I'm truly honored to be here with you and with Keisha to discuss this absolute marvelous book that everybody should go and buy. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here, and great questions.
I love that, Tamara, your analysis of language as a history and English teacher. I think that that's so important. And speaking of thinking about that language, I encourage, if you're an educator, that you also couple that with Leslie Payne's reading his work, his speech entitled "The Night I Stopped Being a Negro," because I think also his language in there is powerful and will give you insight into Malcolm as well.
That was an essay. That wasn't a speech. That was
I'm sorry, an essay. The essay.
Yeah.
I've heard him read parts of it, so
Yeah.
I think that that's why. So his essay, which is really good. Okay, so speaking of students, the student question submissions are available. You can get a chance, middle and high school students, to win a $50 gift certificate for use in the Gilder Lehrman gift shop by submitting a question if it's featured on the book breaks using a Google form. So we hope that you will submit your questions. This week's question was really good. And so what's next? After you have visited the Gilder Lehrman bookshop to purchase The Dead Are Rising, and we encourage you to do that. It is worth all of the rave reviews and awards that it has received. And you read that yourself as well, and if you're a teacher, especially with your students. Next week, Book Breaks features Carrie Gibson's El Norte, the epic and forgotten story of Hispanic North America. You can watch the archives of more than 100 scholar presentations on Book Breaks, and be sure to visit gilderlehrman.org for other documents, essays, digital expeditions, and more. We thank you for your participation this week, and thank you again, Tamara, for gracing us with your presence and bringing such an awesome book to life. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.